Hello, welcome back to the David Watson podcast. Today I had the great pleasure of talking with Sydney Lea, poet whose life has spanned 81 years. And we've discussed life, I guess. I'm not sure what else to say. I hope you enjoy the episode as much as I enjoyed talking to Sydney. Hello, welcome to the David Watson podcast. Thank you for joining me. And so I've been asked to, or I've asked for you to come on and we're going to talk about your 23rd book. But before that, before we started recording, you were telling me about when you were in my neck of the woods, Salisbury, Stonehenge, and you have done a little bit of Europe. How do you kind of find that history and that architecture?
Well, I remember my father was briefly in the export import business, and when I was 10 years old, thank heavens, he pulled me out of school and we took a tour of Europe, and I remember just being absolutely agape to see these things that were so ancient. And I find, unfortunately, in the era of social media and so on and so forth, when I first took my children there, we spent the better part of a year in 1988 in Tuscany. I had a Guggenheim Fellowship, and they were impressed, but not nearly the same way that I was. They'd seen it all,
Yeah.
on their screen or whatever it might be. But yes, and I've gone back in the old days in the 60s. I spent a lot of time in France, and then my late and wonderful grandfather-in-law, who was an Italian immigrant, said that if we didn't go to Italy on our honeymoon, that he wasn't coming to the wedding. So we went, and I was much taken by what I saw. I think in some respects naively, as one does, but I liked it enough that I took it upon myself to learn Italian, and then we spent also the better part of a year in Budapest. That was another fellowship, and that was a language that was said to humble me. I put on my I put on my application. Oh, I'm good with languages. I'll study Hungarian before I come over. And I called a dear friend of mine. He's dead since. Who was a professor of Slavic languages at Dartmouth College, where I was teaching at the time, and he spoke 19 languages, including Turkish. And I said, "Who's going to teach me Hungarian, Walter?" He said, "No one on earth." I said, "Oh, well, certainly you tried." And he said, "Yes, I did try. It was much too hard." And I said, "Well, I think I'm sentenced to a year of muteness."
Wow.
But
How
yes,
does somebody learn 19 languages?
he was one of those Jews who was chased all over Europe, and
Yeah.
he just had an ear for them. But he was also Oxford educated and had studied languages there. He's, his native language was German. Uh, he, I'm not really exactly sure when he took up the study of Slavic languages. I presume quite young, uh, but I think he spoke most of those. He spoke strange things like Danish
Yeah.
and what have you. He's just a man that had an extraordinary ear.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Um, when you said to me, and I'm sorry, 'cause I'm going to go off track completely here. You said to me about when you was a child, because your dad was in the import export business. He pulled you out of school and took you traveling with him. How old were you?
I was 10. I was 10. It was 1953. And amongst other things, I remember very acutely was going to the to the Omaha Beach in Normandy, where he was charged with what was then called a company of quote colored troops in the old segregated army.
Yeah.
Lost a lot of men there, and he was a, a very genial man, but tended to be, unlike me, understated. And I noticed he was becoming more and more animated as we approached the site. And then, to my absolute horror, he let go a great projectile vomit over the edge of the cliffs. And I remember thinking, well, what's wrong with that? Something's terrible. He said, well, I lost a lot of men here. And I said, well, that was 8 years ago, for heaven's sake. Aren't you over it
Yeah.
yet? So I thought as a 10-year-old. Uh, but at any rate, that was my first exposure to Europe. But we landed in Bremerhaven, I think, and then we went to Luxembourg, we went to Belgium, we went to France, we went to Spain, went to England. I think that exhausts the list. And we weren't long in any of those places, but
But it
enough for
must have
me
been
to
an
see the
incredible adventure for a 10-year-old.
Oh, it was an amazing adventure. I mean, I was delighted, and I was delighted, amongst other things, to have my father's exclusive attention. At that time, I was one of three brothers. Later along, two sisters came, but I was very happy to be solo with.
Yeah. So the book, something that intrigues me is the title, What Shine's About.
Uh-huh. Well, it's I write these things without thinking much about what they're about until they're over. But as I went to make this connection amongst the various poems to make what the French would call a well-made book, or so I hoped. Uh, I I noticed that one of the recurring interests in the book was how, I'm 81 years old now, pinch me, but the difference in how I regarded things when I first experienced them, from early childhood to young manhood, and the way I look back on them now. There's a different perspective. And what shines, um, I had my mother was quite a wonderful woman in many ways, but unfortunately she had substance abuse problems, which made life complex. She did the best she could. She was never able to recover, but she lived an astonishing long life, given how much she put into her frame. Uh, and when I wanted to look back and see, amongst all the complexities and difficulties of our relationship, what shines. That was what motivated that poem. As I say, as I look back on it, that seems to be the underlying impulse. And there were things, obviously, and she made a great effort in many ways, but that's a nasty ailment.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very. Um, so taking that, and this is a kind of cliche question, but it will lead into another one as well. What would you tell your younger self if it was possible?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think I suppose if I've learned any life lessons, there are a couple that occur to me. One is that every time you think there's a simple answer to a situation, there's not. And the other is that not every situation that puts you under some kind of duress is a crisis that will alter your life forever.
Yeah.
These things pass and you move on. But I just remember being quite depressed sometimes as a rather young boy, thinking, well, I'll never amount to much. My poor mom, she had was a very bright woman, and she was prepared to go to university, but her father had died when she was only 5, and her bachelor uncle, who became the paterfamilias, simply said, "Women don't go to college."
Yeah.
And so I, as the firstborn, became her vicar, I think, to some degree. And she was forever saying, apply yourself. Well, I did pretty well in school, but it was never quite good enough. And one internalizes that, gee, I'll never amount to anything and how can I apply myself more? Well, it turns out that I can't. And it turns out, actually, in retrospect, that I've applied myself pretty assiduously for a long, long time to those things which I found important: teaching, writing, fatherhood, and now, praise be, grandfatherhood 7 times over, about to be eight.
Congratulations.
But yeah, but when one is young, everything seems like or at least it did to me. Often there were situations where I thought, well, that's the end of the world, including, of course, the requisite breakup with the love of your life without whom you couldn't live at 16, and here I am, 81. So it seems I survived.
Which actually leads nicely into my next question. It's imagine your younger self at a certain stage. What poem or how would your younger self write write something for you to read today?
It's something that reflects my attitude at a certain age, and
Yeah, no,
whose
but like your younger
complexity
self.
I only whose complexity I recognize as an older person. Let me think. Oh, I know one. Bear with me while I find it. Um, when I think in about the same year that I went to Europe with my dad, uh, my grandmother, whose house we lived in, she'd been born there as my mother was, uh, had bought what we called a hi-fi back in those days, which was a step up from the desktop phonograph, Victrola or whatever. And it was, she bought it because she was allegedly a lover of classical music. But what she mostly did would be put on some symphony and then fall immediately asleep, just as she did at the Symphony Hall, often enough. But that hi-fi, I remember that very vividly. I remember it's being turned on for the first time, at least in my presence. And it involved both my parents, and it's just called hi-fi. I think both little sisters were still too young for school. We brothers not many years older. I suspect that what I say is more than a bit sentimental and may not have a basis in anything real back then. So be it, but let me keep it. The five of us hearing the tune, the strings and horns so alive. It's good to be where we are, near our parents' new hi-fi, which spills into every corner. The fidelity, almost shocking. They've told us about its wonders, and now at last they own one. Having adjusted some knob, they stand stone still for a moment, as if in a sort of trance. Of course, they're both long gone, so of course they no longer dance, cheeks touching or anyhow. But as long as I say so, they do. Indeed, the song I hear now is precisely cheek to cheek. Now, why would anyone talk about swimming in a river or a creek? Or maybe it's actually fishing. Who cares? Strange bliss pours forth as long as the record keeps spinning. Sickness, regret, and death will all arrive in time. And rancor, I won't forget the rancor. This evening, however, we brothers and sisters watch, enchanted, 5 children together on the couch with the fancy lace, while our faithful parents glide in what looks like a fond embrace.
That's really nice.
Thank you.
There's about something stood it. There was so many things that stood out on that for me as I was listening, because there's the observation that you don't often see adults excited about something when you're a child, and then there's the because the music is playing and they're dancing, and there's that child confusion listening to the songs, like why are you obsessed with this creek, this water? And then there's the romance of the parents dancing at the same time, you know, and
Yes, yes.
there's so many levels to it.
That poem was published in the Atlantic, which is a fairly widely circulated American magazine. And to my surprise and pleasure, a woman wrote me an email. She found my address on my website, I suppose, and said that she'd really enjoyed the poem. Her grandfather had written it. Irving Berlin had written the song, and so it had a special resonance for her. That was
Oh,
a
what?
novel experience for me.
Uh, yeah, I mean that would be massive, wouldn't it, to have a relative reach out and say, that my grandfather wrote
Yeah,
that song. Oh,
yeah,
that's a nice coming together of two pieces of art.
it is. Yes, indeed.
So, on the theme of your mum always telling you to apply yourself, and this is your 23rd book. In the period of time of writing those 23 books, what stands out?
Well, I'll tell you what stands out was a happy accident, which at first looked like misfortune. I I was teaching at Dartmouth College at the time, and I was up for academic tenure. And back in those days, as today, there was that saying, "publish or perish." And in those days, it meant only that one had to publish a few essays that no one would read and put them in prominent erudite places, and that would make the cut. Nowadays, it's a book, but I I the, I told the chairman that I had a book of poems under contract, and he said, "Well, that's not real publishing. We don't count that as real publishing." So I liked where I was. I had small children, one of whom was in first grade, I think, at the time. So I wanted to stay, and so I took my dissertation that I'd done for my doctorate at Yale. Uh, uh, a volume which is inscrutable to anyone, including its author. I came under the influence of the so-called theorists, and theory and I don't get along that well. But at any rate, I said, well, it just was very, very difficult for me to finish it. Finally, I did, and a year later, this thing came up, and I said, well, I'll just go plumb a few chapters out of my dissertation to publish somewhere, and maybe that will help me. So I went over to the library and I went into the reference room, which I liked to use for whatever contemplation I was capable of, because there was almost never anybody there, except for the very, very stern doyen of that particular room, whose name was, and I didn't make this up, and neither did Charles Dickens. Her name was Miss Wormwood. And I, uh, I looked into that dissertation and I swear I had a feeling very like vertigo. And I said aloud, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. She looked at me sternly, said she. It was only she and I in the room. And so I closed the dissertation. I said, well, I'm just going to keep on writing poetry and let the chips fall where they might. And I did not get tenure. Uh, I was given a year in which to find a new job. I'd continue to teach. And the chairman of the department, the one preceding had been a great friend of mine, remained so until he died. But the one succeeding didn't like me very much, and the feeling was reciprocated. We'd never had a confrontation, but it was quite clear that we rubbed each other the wrong way. And I think he took advantage of that year to assign me the most pedestrian and boring and time-consuming teaching schedule I could possibly have. All freshmen, first year students, their weekly themes, 70 of them at a clip or whatever it might be. So I saw this and I said, well, it was in summertime, and I said, well, I'll drive down and talk to this gent. And uh, and I all the way in, I said, be moderate, don't lose your temper or whatever. Well, within 10 minutes of talking with this gent, I said, I'm not going to teach those courses. He said, well, you are going to teach those courses. They're the ones I've assigned you. And I said, no, I'm not, because I'm never stepping foot in this building again. And I'm not proud of this, but I said, furthermore, if you're walking in the streets downtown, be looking over your shoulder because I really don't like you at all. And so I got in my car and I was driving home and I said, what in the world? What have you done? What are you going to do? And to prove that there's a God looking over my life, I was walking up the steps to our house and the phone was ringing. And it was a man from Middlebury College, which is also a well-regarded liberal arts college here. And they had a staff member, a very nice man. I knew him. He was actually a young novelist who had some terrible rare blood disease, and he was not going to be able to teach that year. Subsequently, he died of this disease, alas. And he said, well, will you step in and take over his courses? And I said, well, yes, I'd be glad to do that. And I stayed there for like, I think 29 years. So it just worked out very, very, very conveniently for me.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, how people can bring out the best in you.
Yes, it's true. I'm circling back to that earlier question. What would I tell my younger self? And I come from a comfortable middle class background and so on. So this doesn't apply to some poor bloke who's trying to scratch out a living mining in Wales or whatever it might be. But I would say to myself, you know, don't do what you should do according to others. Do what you're impelled to do from within. Because every time I've done that, every time I've taken the leap, it's worked out well for me. And that was just one example right there that I gave you, a rather dramatic example in my career, if the truth be known. Middlebury College had a longer tradition, thanks in part to the proximity of Robert Frost, of professors who were also so-called, I don't like the term, but so-called creative writers. So I fit
Yeah.
right in.
What is it about the term you don't like?
I don't know. It just seems to me that there's as much creativity in a good soup as there is in writing a poem. I something about the word now, and now there's a term that I refuse to use. I've just published a book of personal essays. It's, I think, my fifth such book, and there's people use this generic term creative nonfiction. It drives me nuts. I mean, that's just an awful. That's something made up by I don't know what. At any rate, so I actually these are personal essays. They're not creative nonfiction. They're nonfiction, but all they are accounts of how I regard things, on a given day.
Yeah, because I mean, creative non-fiction doesn't even make sense.
No, it's just awful.
Yeah,
I won't use it. I won't use it. And if I publish in magazines and they show me a contributor's note which uses the term, I immediately object and say no, I don't want to use that. I don't want
yeah.
to connect that with my name.
I have the same feeling when I see companies talk about an holistic approach to work-life balance or something like that. And it's
Yeah, that's another much abused holistic. Yeah.
yeah, as soon as I see holistic, I was just like, I start to tear up, and it's time to walk because it turns up in like business pamphlets and
Oh yes,
adverts,
it
you
certainly
know,
does.
and there's nothing holistic about working 42 hours a week for a company.
No, I quite agree. Even if the company sells holistic products,
Yeah,
but
yeah, you're still going to be shelf stacking or working the warehouse. It's not holistic,
that,
no matter how
that
many scented candles you shifted that week.
well said.
It's just- and I've coached over the years. I've coached some business clients, and they've used that term in their literature. And I'll ask them, "What does holistic mean?" And it's to
Yeah.
just glaze over, and it's just like, just I don't know.
Deer in the headlights, yes.
So
uh,
yeah, this I wanted to ask you about the Pulitzer Prize. What is it exactly? Because I know the name and I know it as an institution, if you like, but I realised upon reading the bio, so actually I don't know what it is really. It's just
yeah.
a name that's put out
Well,
there.
Joseph Pulitzer was a journalist, very successful. I think he was a newspaper owner. I should know more about this than I do. Anyway, he established they left a lot of money for these prizes, uh, and they go across various disciplines. There's a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, for drama, for poetry, uh, for journalism, on and on. And the Pulitzer Prize is one of two American prizes which is regarded as sort of the feather in your cap.
Yeah.
One is Pulitzer Prize. The other is called the National Book Award. Uh, and I was uh, I was one of three finalists for the Pulitzer Prize back a while, and people would say, "Well, you came so close. Next time." But the thing is that the judges revolve from year to year, so uh, I haven't had a knock on the door since. I've had other distinctions that I'm proud enough of, like being my state's poet laureate and receiving their highest arts award, which is called the Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts, which doesn't sound like much because Vermont is such a tiny state, and yet it has more poets and novelists per capita than any other in the nation. I
Oh
didn't
wow.
know that until the
No.
Arts Council broadcast it. So I have some good competition, and I don't, that I became poet laureate did not make me all of a sudden think, well, I'm the best poet in Vermont. I could think of a dozen people to whom it could have gone, but uh, it I received that distinction at a very timely moment in my life because I had just retired from teaching. I'd been teaching back at Dartmouth in a graduate program for about 10 years, and I had announced my retirement. I was 67 years old, and the last of our five children had decamped for college. Uh, so the days looked like they were going to be pretty long. And when I got that award, you're not under any obligation to do anything. My predecessor, a wonderful poet named Ruth Ellen, was legally blind, so she didn't get out much. But I decided I was going to visit community libraries around the state to get away from the universities and the libraries. I mean, the institutional libraries, and just go to these small community libraries uh, where presumably whoever showed up liked books. They didn't necessarily like poetry, but they might be curious. And I didn't go to read my own material. I did read some, but for the most part, I said about explaining from my perspective what I thought poetry could accomplish that other modes of discourse could not. And I don't know, it didn't really surprise me because I'm old enough to have learned this lesson that all the smart people are not within the university walls by a long, long shot. And there were bright people everywhere I went. My favorite moment, I went to a town way up north in the state, right on the Quebec border. And a gent walked in who he was in bib overalls and he smelled of the barn. He was clearly not some refugee stockbroker who was pretending to be a farmer or whatever. And he sat there and he had a book in his lap. And when it was over, he came up and he said, "I really enjoyed what you had to say." And I said, "What's the book anyway?" He said, "Well, this is it's Mountain Interval by Robert Frost." And I said, "Oh, I like that volume very much." And he said, "How many poems can you say out of it?" And I puffed myself up and I said, "I bet I could recite three or four." He said, "I could say them all." Yeah, Frost used to say, "I say my poetry rather than I read." So I tested him, and I didn't test him on things like stopping by woods on a snowy evening or any of the famous ones, but ones that I'd scarcely heard of myself, like the gum gatherer or whatever. And I gave him two or three, and he never missed a beat. And I said, "Well, how is it that you're able to do this?" And he said, "Well, my dad had a farm that abutted Frost's property down in Ripton, Vermont, and they became friends. And he gave my dad a copy of his books, and every night he would read them aloud to us as children. And I became hooked on Robert Frost, and uh, I've read him and reread him ever since." I said, "Do you read other poets?" He said, "No, just Frost." But that was a really interesting moment, a surprising one and a gratifying one.
Yeah, that's it's funny, isn't it? Because poetry, I don't know that I nearly said it's fallen out of fashion, but I think that's a disservice. I think it's just poetry. Maybe once upon a time, because there weren't the distractions of radio, TV, and the internet, it was both something that children could listen to and discover, as well as parents could be intellectual about. And
Yes,
and
that's true.
yes,
That's true, and there's a larger audience for poetry in America than you might imagine. And apparently it spiked considerably during the height of the COVID
yeah,
crisis, which is interesting to me. Um, but David, has always been uh, a minority art, certainly in America at any rate. We had the so-called schoolroom poets like uh, uh, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, John Green. All of them had three names apparently, and people read them and recited them and so on. And when that wave passed, the last poet to make who could live on poetry alone was Frost himself. I don't
yeah,
think anybody else has ever made a living since, and that's hence the increasing connection of poetry for writing in general to the academy, uh, which about which I have mixed feelings. Obviously, I thrived on it in my own way, but I I resist what I call creeping MFAism, uh, which is many more writers than readers. Remember Flannery O'Connor saying this. Do you think that teaching poetry in college discourages people from writing poetry or writing from being writers? Her response was, "It doesn't discourage enough of them."
but it's interesting. How would you explain to somebody? And maybe explain is the wrong way of going about the question. But if somebody young or old ever would like to try poetry, because where would you advise them to start? Like, if they want to just start writing some things down.
That's But I have my own personal prejudices. I would send them back to uh, uh, the UK's romantics. I'd send them back to Coleridge and to Keats or probably Keats was the most approachable for someone who's brand new to that sort of reading. Um, you know, to get off on another hobby horse of mine, there are a number. I don't know every poet in the states, but I know a lot of them,
Yeah,
and many of them are always moaning about how they don't get enough of a readership, and they say, well, it's commercialism or it's capitalism or it's whatever it may be. And I look at some of the poetry that's being written contemporarily in the New Yorker magazine or whatever, and I said, well, if you want to be read, why don't you write something that's actually readable?
Yeah.
You shouldn't, it seems odd to me that if you're writing poetry and you're trying to communicate with someone, you would put so many barriers to comprehension in the way. That's one of the reasons that I too am a Frost admirer, because I think he's one of the most complex poets that we've generated, and yet some everybody can get something out of a Frost poem. They can enter the world that is being described, and school kids do, and then doctoral candidates do, and critics do as well. But I have the feeling with a lot of poetry, there's sort of a barrier put up and say, well, you have to learn a sort of special language, or else you can't come into my world. So the paucity, relative paucity of readership, though it's always prevailed, uh, is exacerbated, I think, by the nature of a lot of contemporary practice.
Because that's the thing about poetry, in a sense, is that, like you say, when you meet people who say they're a fan of poetry, my own experience is when they talk about poetry and being a fan of poetry, it almost seems like an intellectual supremacy over somebody. But they also,
Yeah.
but after spending 5 minutes with them, you realise they could kill the mood at a funeral, and you're just like, "Oh, it's going to be a long conversation."
I'll tell you a personal story. We live in a very rural part of the state, as close to Quebec, closer to Quebec than we are to Massachusetts. And we had a neighbor who just died a few years ago. He was 97 when he died, and he was a wonderful neighbor. He'd gone to school almost through eighth grade, but he said in the spring of eighth grade there was such a nice day he just couldn't face it, so he left for good and went to work in the woods. But he had he had very few filters. He
Yeah,
would say what was on his mind, no matter what it was. And when I first met him, he said, "I understand you're a writer." I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, I ain't going to read nothing you ever wrote. I can tell you that right now." I says, "Because all I read is Louis L'Amour." He says, "Once you get done reading him, you don't want to read nobody else." Uh, so the only thing of mine I think he ever did write was a satirical little poem I did for his 70th wedding anniversary, his and his wife. Uh, but when I sit down to write, I always have him in mind. I say, if he were to read something of mine, which he won't or wouldn't, if he were able to or inclined to, would he just be totally mystified, or would he understand sort of the general drift of where I'm going? And I think that when I talk about creeping MFAism, I never did an MFA. I never took a so-called creative writing course. I'm too
mm,
old, but at all events, uh, uh, I think one of the difficulties with in this proliferation of MFA programs and so on is that so many aspirant and beginning writers are so busy talking to people who think the way they do that they imagine everybody thinks that way, which
yeah,
is not true. Which is why I like to keep my neighbor Tink in the back of my mind, rest his memory, uh, to remind me that there are people out there who have thoughts and feelings and who are bright and humorous and well experienced, and they're just as important as any Don somewhere.
it is, because there are poems out there, and people who write poems, and that they can resonate with people in a different way. Because
Hmm.
I mean, people will hear a song and they'll talk about the lyrics of the song, but
Hmm.
often it's the way the music glides with the lyrics that help it
Yeah,
resonate with you. Whereas
yeah.
sometimes you can read a poem, even if you don't remember it. Some of the funniest poems I've ever read were on the inside of a toilet wall. But it but they leave a mark. They leave something with you. They make you think. They make they make you chuckle, or they make you feel
Yes,
sad or remorse. And words have
yes,
that power.
yes. I have a friend. I don't see him much. We were classmates at university, uh, and he's been a faithful reader of my work all along. But he's forever saying, "Well, you have to write novels." Well, I have written one, and I have another one coming out this spring. But I've been principally a poet. He said, poetry doesn't reach many people. I want you to write a novel where a lot of people will hear your voice. And I said, well, I write poetry mostly because it's what I do, as
Mm,
a way of making sense of an otherwise desultory life like anybody's. Uh, and I said, nobody's ever memorized a novel, have they?
yeah,
And that came from, I don't know where that thought came from, but I thought about it, and it's true. That's one virtue of poetry, that if it's well wrought, not necessarily that you're going to memorize it, but it will be memorable as a small unit in some way. And I rather like that.
yeah. I do. I like that because there's something about a poem that can it can the poem you read earlier about being a child, watching your parents with a new hi-fi, and then you, your brothers, and your sisters all watching them basically being romantic and dancing and
Yeah,
gliding and cheek to
yeah,
cheek. And again, but then there's the child's reference of, I don't know why they're dancing to a song about a creek and fishing.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And
Exactly.
and there's so much. Yeah, there's so many dynamics going on all at once.
Yes. Well, that's one of the things that I tended to bring to those community libraries. I said that one the thing that intrigues me about poetry, both as reader and writer, is the fact that it's a vehicle in which a number of ideas, uh, some in fact contradictory of one another, can
Mm,
be can be presented without sounding like a total muddle. Uh, and the one example I used was Frost's famous poem, "The Road Not Taken," uh,
yep,
and people trot that out at retirement dinners and graduation ceremonies. The rugged New Englander, independent, completely overlooking lines in the poem, like I took the other as just as fair, though. Uh, as for where the passing there had worn them, really about the same.
yeah,
And each was, so that's overlooked. But the fact is, he's saying there, and at the end he says, "I shall be saying this with a sigh. Somewhere ages hence, I will be saying this with a sigh. Two roads diverge in the wood, and I chose the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." Well, there are a number of ways in which you can take that. I mean, it could be, and they'll buy it, and they did, in fact.
yeah,
They'll buy that as a kind of a testimony of independence. But there was some whimsy involved in that so-called choice too. I mean, I could have. They were worn equally about the same. Uh, but you come to the end of that poem, and what he's really doing is saying, you know, ponder these opposites. What do you make of it? How does that relate to your life? And I like that about poetry. There's another poem by a late American poet named James Wright, who was very good, I thought. And it's called "Autumn Comes to Martins Ferry, Ohio." Martins Ferry, Ohio, is in the kind of the mining belt of the state of Ohio, and that's where Wright was from. And and he talks about being in the Shreve High football stadium, American football, mind you, uh, 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 on an autumn day, and he looks around and he looks at He looks at the town in which he lives, which is filled with you know, broken people working in the mines. Even the Black Night Watchman is ruptured. He has a rupture and so on. And at the end of the poem, he says, and for all these reasons, their sons grow suicidally beautiful and gallop ferociously against each other's bodies. Well, the simple thing is to say, you know, these poor people who can't get a break, you know, in a society, and they're spending all this time with football and spending money on it and so on. And that's a proper conclusion. On the other hand, where is the poet? He's in the Shreve High football stadium. So it's not that the sons grow suicidal. It's not that they grow beautiful, but they become suicidally beautiful, which is a really interesting
Yeah,
phrase, which illustrates what I'm trying to talk about, I think.
it is. So there's that suicidally beautiful reminds me of. Do you remember the MASH theme tune, "Suicide is Painless"?
I'm sorry, the which?
Do you remember the Vietnam comedy MASH, the
Oh, yes,
Americans?
yes,
Do you
yes, I
remember the
really
theme
do.
tune, "Suicide is Painless"?
Yes, I do. I do.
And
I'd forgotten that's very relevant, it seems to me, yes. Yeah.
yeah, because if people ever listen to the lyrics of that song, and it talks about how time gets into your skin and it catches up with you in the end, and you just like, and that's like you say, that suicidally beautiful. As soon as you said that popped into my head. Is
Thanks for mentioning that because I want to go back and look at the lyrics. You know, of course, in the TV series, they just played it instrumentally. But I do remember once reading lyrics, and I'm going to go back to looking at that again.
yeah,
Thanks for that.
the lyrics to that song are very deep, very powerful because you realize, just exactly what they're talking about.
Right, right.
Because like you say, you can get carried away with as I was saying earlier, if a tune, or a soundtrack is phenomenal enough or catches your heart enough, you can
Yeah,
ignore the lyrics, even if you've. And when I say you ignore the lyrics, you might be able to recite the lyrics, but you've never listened to them.
yeah.
You've never understood what they were trying to tell you. But
Well put. Yes.
and yeah. So when I hear that song and the lyrics to that song, it's yeah, it's about how time it's going to kill all of us in the end. So, and it almost doesn't matter where you die. It's a very deep, deep song. So we'll just change the mood now. Uh, one of the things, because how many books have you actually written in total?
Uh, well, if you, I have. With this new book of creative nonfiction, that would make 24, and then I have a novel coming out in the spring, which would make it 25.
But didn't you say earlier you wrote some books of essays?
Yes, I did. Uh, so I think, let me think. I think this is my sixth book of same, I believe. That would make 22, and then I have a. It's not quite a scholarly book. It has literary essays in it, but I hope it's not academic. It's not heavily annotated or
Mm.
research, but it kind of rehearses my relationship to poetry and other kinds of literature uh, over the years. So that would make 24, and if my math is right. I have to look at my own curriculum vitae sometimes to kind of keep
Yeah.
things straight. It's becoming a problem as I age. My short-term memory is not what it was, and I say, well, I said that in a poem, but which book was it in? And I have to rustle around and find it. But at any rate, yeah. Well, I've done a lot of writing. It's just, and I've never, people say, well, you must be marvelously disciplined. There's no discipline at all involved. I mean, it's what I love to do. The discipline is used to be involved, especially when the children were small. Go pick up the kids at school, go grocery shopping. That tear yourself away from this thing that is so pleasurable to you to do the normal quotidian things that anybody does.
Well, that's quite interesting then, is it? Because one of the common questions that, and I also ask this question is, what's the writing process and how do you sit down and discipline? But if you enjoy it, it's how do you pull yourself away to do the day to day things that you survive with?
Yeah. It's interesting because over the years I've met scores and scores of aspirant young poets, and the ones who have succeeded, and some have succeeded rather brilliantly, uh, are the ones for whom there appeared to be no substitute for writing, um, and so they persisted, and I think that persistence is important as what we call talent. Uh, Case in point, I think the single most gifted student I ever had was a young woman from the state of Oregon, and she could write rings around anybody her age. I mean, she was terrific. She went off and married her high school sweetheart and took over his father's Chevrolet agency. And I wrote to her and I said, you know, you're such a good writer. Why have you just given it up altogether? And she said, well, yes, it was great fun in college and so on, but it's not really something I want to spend a lot of time doing now. In effect, I have other fish to fry. Uh, and there's nothing morally reprehensible about that, but it's very interesting that whereas another writer is quite a famous novelist now named Louise Erdrich, she was just not going to be denied. She just kept writing and writing, and like everybody else in her younger years, she was rejected right, left, and center. But then she just persisted, and now well, she won a Pulitzer Prize. Put it that way.
Yeah. So I'm just going to finish with one last question, and it's completely different. If if you can imagine, you could go anywhere in the world, any time, any place, any time. Where would you go? What car would you be driving? And what music would you be listening to?
Ah, that's a big question, David. I tell you, in my in my older age, I've fallen in love with the nation of Slovenia, part of the old Yugoslavia.
Yep.
Uh, as it happened, I made a friend, a lovely, brilliant, very funny man who was in the State Department in Budapest that year that I was there. And 10 years later, he said, "Why don't you come back and we'll do a reading? I'll find a Hungarian writer to read with you, and then you can stay with us for the Easter vacation." So I did that, and it was a pleasure. And then on the way to the airport, he said, "Would you like me to let the word out to my counterparts that you're on this side of the pond and so on and so forth?" And I said, "Yes." And I went to a number of places, but the capital of Slovenia, Ljubljana, I went to the Pen Club, and a huge audience. And afterwards, people would walk up and say, "Well, I am Victor, I too am poet," or "I am Natasha, I too am poet," and so on. And I said, this is where poets go to die. Now, mind you, it's older as everywhere else, but I became great friends with a man who translated my work for the occasion. He had a daily 60-minute poetry show on the national radio. I was on that, and we became very, very close friends. He kept finding, I did him a favor because I knew Robert Frost's literary executor, and I got Robert Frost's publisher to waive the exorbitant republication fee for the 50 poems that he had translated. And he kept finding reasons to invite me back. So I think I've been there. I must have been there 16, 17 times, including this past October, because he was having some health issues that worried me. But it's a beautiful little nation, ultra civilized. and very sympathetic to poetry. So it's a win-win-win across the board. I'd like to, if I had encountered the country younger, I think I would have tried to learn that language because I've become so fond of so many people there, in addition to their sort of general cultural welcome to what I do. And what music would I be listening to? Well, I'm a jazz fan principally. I'd be probably playing old. I'm so quaint that I have CDs. In fact, I even have a record. Uh, I'd be playing musicians from what's called the late bop era: Thelonious Monk, Sonny Rollins, Max Roach, Miles Davis, what have you. And what would I be driving? I don't know. Whatever was available from the credit card agency, I suppose. Last time I didn't drive anything because my friend's daughter, who's a well-known opera singer in the country, she kind of took over and drove me every place I wanted to go. So that was drove me and my wife because we were there together.
It's perfect. Thank you very much for your time. It's really appreciated.
Well, I've really enjoyed it very much, David, and Godspeed. Thanks again.
And there you have it, Sydney Lea. I'm fascinated by how prolific writers write, and for Sydney, it was no exception. He just loves doing it, and I suppose it is that simple. Genuinely, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please do check out the links below. Go and find Sydney, read his work, see what else he's done. And as always, please like, subscribe, share, and wherever you are, whatever you believe, please take care. Thank you for listening.